I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
You can turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. That's where we're going to be this evening. We have spent the last 3 weeks dealing with our introduction to the book, learning about a little bit about the history that's going on at this time period, and a little bit about the prophet Daniel and what we're going to see in this book. And so now this evening, we're going to actually begin our verse-by-verse look. And really, this book can be divided into 2 sections. There's going to be a narrative section, and that will be the first few chapters of this book. The narrative is going to take us from about 605 BC all the way to the time period when the Jews actually returned from captivity. Daniel's not going to return with them, but others are. And so the narrative for the first few chapters goes of our time period of 70 years. And that's going to be a lot of history very quick. And then the last part of the book is dealing with prophecy. We're going to have prophecy about kingdoms. We're going to have prophecy that is still yet ahead for Daniel, fulfilled in Christ, but yet ahead for Daniel, in fact, quite far ahead for Daniel. Daniel wouldn't see it. The people who returned from captivity wouldn't see it. And it would actually come in the time of Christ and after Christ. And so that part of the book is a little deeper, dealing with figures of speech. But the first 6 chapters and such is a little easier to understand. We teach a lot of these stories to children, but they aren't aimed at children. They're easy to explain to children, but they are actually aimed at a more adult audience. And there's a lot more to these stories than we sometimes will teach the children. Let's get the first 7 verses. I will join the reading this evening. We'll do 3 verses each. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. And we'll start with Naomi, go to Henry, and then I'll get the last verse.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility.
Young man in whom there was no blemish, good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, who might teach language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah, Daniel, Ananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah.
To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Now here we have, again, when you compare the stories in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Jeremiah, it's very easy to get confused as to what goes on, especially in the first 2 verses of Daniel. We are in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim, we know, reigned 11 years. And so this is the first wave of captivity. Jehoiakim will die in the 2nd wave that would occur around 7 to 8 years later. But so we have Jehoiakim, he was king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now we do need to know something here. Nebuchadnezzar, at the time of the Battle of Carchemish, which occurred just before this, was not king of Babylon yet. And that's important because you might get confused in chapter 2 when we talk about second year as exactly what's going on. But Nebuchadnezzar was, we might call, the crown prince at that time. Nebuchadnezzar, I think that was the king. I forget off the top of my head. His father, let's just say that, was king of Babylon, but he was very old. Nebuchadnezzar, from everything I've read from history, was not the official king, but he was involved in the day-to-day affairs, and of course he was leading armies in the field. And at this time of the first siege of Jerusalem, his father died. And he had to actually go back to Babylon to ensure that his brothers didn't take the throne instead of him. Remember, sibling rivalry, especially when it came to kings, was very much a thing. And so Nebuchadnezzar, even though he was gone here, it is still said that he besieged Jerusalem, and he is still called the king here, even though at the beginning of this he was not. And so people come along and say, well, there's a contradiction here. He wasn't king of Babylon at the time. We have to remember, Daniel is not writing a daily diary here. Nebuchadnezzar is known as king of Babylon. That's what he's famous for. And so, even in this verse, he is referred to by the title we would know him, king of Babylon. And so he came to Jerusalem, he besieged it. It could be his armies that besieged it, but it was still Nebuchadnezzar. Like as far as whenever our governments do something, our prime minister is Justin Trudeau right now. When we say the Trudeau government does something, we don't always literally mean Justin Trudeau personally did it. It's his representatives that did it. And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have to be actually present, besieging Jerusalem, for it to be true that verse 1 says that he did. We must understand the meaning of it. It was Babylon that did it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. God had said so. God had said through the prophets Jeremiah, through Isaiah earlier, that there was a problem in Judah, sin. They had rebelled. They were worshiping idols. They were not doing what the Lord had commanded. And he was going to send them off into captivity. But Jehoiakim didn't die during this siege. Some, though, of the articles of the house of God were carried away into the land of Shinar. Land of Shinar is what we would call modern-day Iraq. Babylon's the city. Babylonia is sort of what we call the country. But the land of Shinar is basically modern-day Iraq today. And that's just another name for the Babylonian area, the kingdom which Nebuchadnezzar ruled over. We see that in the book of Genesis referred to this, the land of Shinar. And so the articles of the house of God, we don't know what those articles were. We do know some of the articles that would have been in the house of God. We know there'd be like the table of showbread. There would be the lampstands and the altars, and perhaps, although we don't know, the Ark of the Covenant. By this time, the last time we read of the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament would be in the days of Solomon. And we don't read of it ever again past that time. And so, since the temple was raided on numerous occasions after Solomon's reign, it could have been it was taken then, but we don't know. It could have been taken by Nebuchadnezzar for all we know. But whatever Nebuchadnezzar took, the gold of the temple and all the other articles that were in this huge temple, he brought to the house of his God. Nebuchadnezzar was an idolater. He was an evil man. And yet God used evil men to combat evil in Judah. And so, not only did he take some of the articles of the temple, but he also brought back some of the king's descendants and some of the nobility. And among them were the young men, in whom there was no blemish. They were good-looking men. They were gifted men in wisdom, possessing knowledge, and those who were quick to understand. We call them the cream of the crop. He didn't bring, in this time, at least into the king's palace, and some of the king's advisors. He didn't bring the poor people, the people who had been diseased. He brought the best. He brought the best. Those who would be able to learn. Those who would be willing to serve. And he brought them to Babylon. And Ashpenaz, who was the master of the eunuchs, was commanded to do so. And they were told, before they get there, though, they've got to learn the language. And they've got to start studying the literature of the Chaldeans. He wasn't going to let these people speak Hebrew. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have understood them. And moreover, the Hebrews wouldn't have understood Nebuchadnezzar or any of the instructors of the palace. So first, they had to learn the language so that they could communicate. We sometimes do that here. In Canada, there are two main languages, English and French. Now, there are people who speak other languages here, but those are the languages of business. Those are the languages of government. And so if you want to be a part of society, you got to know one of those two languages. It's better if you know both, because you can work anywhere in the country. And so in order to come here, sometimes you might have to learn the language. But once you get here, you almost certainly do. And the same is true if we go to other countries. We want to move to, say, Germany. Got to learn German. Yes, people might speak in English to you a little bit, but if you work there, you're going to have to speak German. Move to France, you're going to have to learn to speak French. Move to China, you're going to have to learn to speak Mandarin or Cantonese or one of the other languages there. You're going to have to do that in order to be able to communicate in those countries. And so these people had to learn the language. They also had to learn a lot about the literature. And of course, that would come with an idolatry as well. The Babylonians weren't a dumb culture. They had a lot to do with mathematics. They had a lot to do with astronomy. They had their astrologers too, and they had their magicians, the occult as well. But they had a lot of culture. They were not a backwards society. And so you had to learn about the literature of the Chaldeans. And then we get to verse 5. These men, even though they were captives, they were well taken care of. They had a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. So they weren't sitting there in jail poor. They actually lived a pretty good life despite being captives and despite being servants. And they weren't starving. They were getting some of the best. And there were how many years training for them, according to verse 5?
3 years.
3 years. So they didn't have a crash course. They didn't have to learn it in a month. No, they had 3 years to learn. And that shows you just how much they were learning. It usually here, we go to high school for 4 years. You go to college to get a bachelor's degree usually takes you 3 or 4 years, depending on the program. And so these guys were going to school. And they had 3 years to do this. And at the end of that time, they were to serve before the king. Now we find 4 men. 4 men. Who are the 4 men? Their Hebrew names, first of all. Who are the 4 men? According to verse 6. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, of course, Daniel's the author of the book. So we know Daniel. We don't know these three men by those names very much. We don't usually refer to Daniel by his Babylonian name, which is Belteshazzar. Don't confuse that with Belshazzar later on in the book. Belteshazzar, that Bel, the B-E-L, that's one of the gods of the Babylonians. So in Daniel's name, you have E-L, and that's the god of the Hebrews. And when you see names like that, like Samuel, Bethel, Daniel, names that end in E-L, that signifies God. E-L, Elohim, God. The God of the Hebrews, the God of the Bible. But Bel is one of the idols of the Babylonians and the other nations around. So Belteshazzar, he's named after Babylonian god now. But we don't usually refer to Daniel by that name. We refer to him by Daniel. But we don't usually refer to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their Hebrew names. We usually refer to them when we teach it to the kids by their Babylonian names. And what were their Babylonian names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So those are the Babylonian names of these three men. Four altogether. And these four men are going to play an important role in this book. Daniel over the course of the entire book, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the course of the first few chapters of this book. And so let's keep those names in place, in the back of our minds, because they are going to be important. So let's now get 8 to 16. We'll do 3 verses again. Start with Naomi, go to Henry, and then I'll read the rest.
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so you would endanger my head with the king?
So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of eunuchs, and said over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion the king's delicacies, as you see fit. So deal with your servants.
So he consulted with them in this matter, and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. All right, so we discussed in verse 5, chapter 1, that they were going to be well fed. They were going to have wine, and we can assume this is alcoholic wine. Or at least it would have had some alcohol in it. I believe that's pretty safe to say, because of the way Daniel is going to speak of it. And they were going to have king's delicacies. We just don't know what those are. However, because verse 8 says he will not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, we can make an assumption that there was something in it that the Jews were not allowed to eat. And of course, if we go back to Leviticus 11, there were some food that the Jews were not allowed to eat. If we go back to Leviticus 11 and read the first few verses, we won't read it all, but we'll read the first few verses, and I'll just do the reading. It'll just be a little faster. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hoofs and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those who chew the cud of those who have cloven hoofs: the camel, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hoofs, is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hoofs, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hoofs, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hoofs, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall eat, their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all in the seas or the rivers that do not have fins or scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that is an abomination to you. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon after its kind, even the raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, the bat. All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet, with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. These are the types of things the Jews were not allowed to eat. And so this was, though, a commandment under the law of Moses. We don't read of these specific instructions before the law of Moses. We sort of do get that there was clean and unclean animals. We weren't really told that before, but we do get some in Genesis of that. I forget which chapter, but we do get, well, I guess it's Noah's Ark that gives us clean and unclean animals, because that's Noah was to bring in certain number of the clean animals, certain number of the unclean animals. So we know that there was clean and unclean animals at that point in time. However, God was very specific here in Leviticus 10. It was, you shall not eat these animals. You shall not touch their carcasses. And so perhaps part of the king's delicacies were some of these things. Sort of like having a Jew over and trying to serve him pork chops. The Jew's not going to do that. And so Daniel asked, and he said, I'm not going to defile. He's going to bring the chief eunuch together, the chief servant, and he says, I'm not going to defile it. I'm not going to do it. Now, what we need to know about Nebuchadnezzar, he's a very harsh man. Someone who stands before Nebuchadnezzar is not going to be scrawny, is not going to be underfed, especially if he's his servant. It's not going to be blemished. Nebuchadnezzar, if someone was a servant of his and looked like that, the person in charge of feeding these servants was going to be in trouble. And so the eunuch was worried here that you're going to look worse. You're going to look malnourished. You're not going to be able to stand before the king in the way that the king wants you to stand before him. And so you're going to look worse than all these other young men. And I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to risk my own life, my own job. And I don't want to put you in danger either, because Nebuchadnezzar could kill you too. You don't fit the bill. Well, you're going to be thrown in prison then. You're going to have other things happen to you. And so Daniel, though, was a little, he was quite adamant. I'm not going to do these things. I'm not going to disobey the Lord. That's an attitude that we should really look to and say, look, if we were put in a situation like that, where we had a choice to do something or not do something, one thing would break the commandments of the Lord, one thing would not. Now, if we don't do that thing that would break the commandments of the Lord, perhaps we're going to get in trouble. Would we be willing to stand up and say, I will serve the Lord, no matter what happens to me? Daniel really wasn't worried about Nebuchadnezzar. He was saying, well, Nebuchadnezzar, basically, he can do with me what he wants. I'm not going to break the word of the Lord. But he gave the servant a way out. He wasn't just going to stand up here and say, you just got to do what I say. He said, give us 10 days. Test us 10 days. Give us vegetables. Like as far as anything that, like beans or peas or something like that. Vegetables, that which the king had. He wasn't asking for a specific diet. He wasn't a vegan. He wasn't a vegetarian or someone on a very weird diet. No, he was asking for things that the king had, that he was allowed to eat. And he was saying, just give us that and water and test us 10 days. And let our appearance be examined before you. Just so you can be certain that we are not going to have the problems that you say. And so the steward agreed. Remember, they had 3 years of training, and so what's 10 days going to really do? Now, at the end of 10 days, shows you that the Lord was with Daniel. And the Lord was with these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was with these men. What was their appearance like after the 10 days? According to verse 15.
Better and fatter.
They look better. They look fatter. In other words, God was with them. I cannot say if you just eat vegetables and drink water, you're going to look better than those who eat these unclean meats. I can't say that. But what I can say is God was with Daniel. God was protecting Daniel, and in fact, God was going to raise Daniel up. Daniel had a purpose in being in Babylon. Daniel was a righteous man when he left. God protected them in bringing them to Babylon in the first place. He wasn't going to die in Judah and Jerusalem. He was going to be important. And so God protected him. And really all the man was worried about was how they looked. He really didn't care about what they ate. If they ate these things and looked good, so be it. And that was what was important. Appearance was important to this man, not really what they ate. He thought the king's delicacies, that was going to fatten you up, that was going to make you look good, that was going to provide you the nutrition you need. Not so here. Daniel and his friends followed the word of the Lord, and God blessed them. Let's get the last 4 or 5 verses. Naomi 17, 18, and 19, Henry 20 and 21.
As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king.
And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, found them 10 times better than all the magicians, astrologers, who were in his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus.
All right. So, who was the provider of knowledge to these men? God was the one who provided them knowledge. They were, yes, studying Chaldean literature, but and language. God would have helped them there. But of course, God gave them more knowledge than that. We know, we're going to read about what Daniel had knowledge in. He could interpret dreams and visions. And so 17 to 21 really is an overview of the entire book. Let's not come along and think, when we get to chapter 2, well, how come Nebuchadnezzar didn't remember Daniel? Well, that's because verses 17 to 21 is an overview of the book, and then we're going to go back and get what Daniel did. So at the end of the days, the end of the 3 years, when the king, when they were to be brought before the king, they were brought before the king, and king interviewed them. There was none found like these 4 men. None whatsoever. Because God was with them. All matters of wisdom and understanding about the king, that the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers and all who were in his realm. That's because God was with him. And of course, Daniel would serve until the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia. And of course, that would be more Babylonian kings, and of course, Cyrus would be the Medo-Persians. We need to remember, though, today, that God is the provider of the wisdom that we need too. We go to James chapter 1 and read verses 5 through 8. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it shall be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. We want to be wise in the Lord. We need to seek out God in faith. Ask God in prayer. God will give you wisdom. Now, is it magical? Is it just, okay, you want a little wisdom? Here you go, there's wisdom. I don't believe that's how God works. He does work through his word. He might put us in situations that would teach us the wisdom we need and we desire. And so we want something. God may open the doors of opportunity that would teach us those things, and so that we can use those things. But God provides us all things that we need to live a godly life. They are found in his word. And we can obtain the knowledge and wisdom that we need in order to serve God. We may not be the smartest person when it comes to mathematics or science or medicine or engineering or technology or anything. We might not be the smartest person on earth, but we can be wise in the Word of God.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to